Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Searching for Political Identity. My name is Brian Eskow. I am your host of this crazy podcast. How lame is that I just said that? Called Searching for Political Identity. This would be a perfect time for me to do an ad, but I have no sponsors yet. So I have nothing to sell you. I wish I did. But I don't. Maybe one day. I will hold out hope. I'm optimistic. I want to wish everyone happy holidays. Merry Christmas if you celebrate Christmas. Happy Hanukkah if you celebrate Hanukkah like I do, I guess, technically. I mean, I was raised Jewish, but I'm very reformed. But my girlfriend, but I can't call her my girlfriend anymore. Teaser, I'll tell you in a second, is very fairly religious, Jewish, happens to be. And so I celebrate Hanukkah. So if you're a Kwanzaa person, happy Kwanzaa to you. I mean, whatever your flavor is, we should all be counting our blessings and marking the years, celebrating in some way, even if it's not particularly religious. It's a good thing. It's not so good when you're depressed, which I was for so long. Holidays kind of suck, but they're better and better every year for me. So I hope the same is true for you. And if you're not feeling good right now, please remain optimistic. Life does get better. I think if you just stick it out, I hope and I think, okay? Be cautiously optimistic. But I hinted at this. I cannot call Alexa my girlfriend anymore. We are now engaged. Yesterday I proposed. I have to say it was perfectly executed. I had a little picnic set up on the beach in La Jolla. It was a cloudy day, but the light was beautiful. The waves were roaring. The ocean was roaring. It was just such a perfect, cute little picnic, little 20-foot beach walk. Boom, I popped the question, said some really nice things that I meant every word of, and had a photographer there to capture the moment. So it was awesome. So I'm just very excited. I passed the bar exam a few weeks ago. I'm now licensed to practice law. How scary is that? In California, I'm engaged. I'm 35 years old. The world is my oyster. I'm in a very different position than I was for, like I keep saying, I was so depressed between 50 and 30, 32. It is just a whole new world for me. And that is a relevant part in my search for political identity. As I emerge from that darkness, am I going to eventually find my way back to the left, a stronger, newer version? Or am I going to continue my drift to the right and solidify myself as a Republican or maybe even a MAGA person? I don't know. But it's a great journey that I'm on. And I'm in a great place and I'm feeling very grateful. With that said, all I have left to say is the conversation you're about to hear, I think, is very good. Thanks to my incredible guest, Jeremy Ryan Slate. He's an expert in ancient Roman history. And if you stick out the whole 90 minutes, you're going to hear pretty much from top to bottom the story of the Roman Empire and certainly some lessons that we can draw from it. So thank you all for being here. And I hope you have a wonderful week and a happy new year. See you next week. Jeremy, welcome, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I've been following you on X for a bit, and it's great to finally connect, man.
No, it's an honor to have you. You're an authority in this space, as far as I can tell. If judging nothing else by the big shows you've been on, you're a big player in this space, and there's obviously some weight behind you. There's some substance behind that just doesn't happen to anybody. So very grateful that you made some time for me.
Hey, thanks for having me, man. I definitely appreciate it.
Yeah. So as we go along and have whatever conversation we're going to have today about ancient Rome, pretty much, and whatever other relevant things might come up. I hope that you could keep in the back of your mind, I'm seeking guidance from thought leaders, that whole thing. You've seen my post then, so I come from this progressive background, but I'm questioning that worldview. I voted for Trump it was my first time voting for a Republican, and I'm not yet comfortable calling myself a this or a that. I'm very much still searching for this political identity, asking myself, what is the proper, coming out of law school, recently, what is the proper role of government? Wait a minute. Is it the socialist value system that I was raised to believe it is? Or is it something different, protecting the concept, that whole political philosophy debate? If you could just keep in the back of your mind, that's the journey I'm on. And if at any point it seems easy for you to make a connection to where you could guide me, great. But otherwise, just looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, and I like to call myself a recovering Republican. I don't know what else to describe myself as, because here's the problem, Brian, is I think one of the major things George Washington warned us against is the creation of political parties. And I think if you look at what factionalism has done to this country, it hasn't done a lot of very good things. And I grew up being somebody that was in a very conservative household. Rush Limbaugh or Sean Hannity were always playing in my house. And I think Limbaugh early in his career is not the same Limbaugh that was later in his career. Later in his career, I have a lot of admiration for a lot of what Rush had to say, and I feel it's very populist. But I think early on, kind of that whole talk radio world is very red team, blue team, right? And it's like, if you're not on the red team, then you're an idiot, and you're on the blue team and you're one of those stupid liberals. And I read a book, and I think it was in 2003. I don't remember the exact year, but it was around then. It was called How Would a Patriot Act by Glenn Greenwald. And it kind of led me down this rabbit hole of realizing that my government doesn't always have my best interests at heart, which was very surprising, right? Because I thought, like, as long as we get the right red team guy in there, everything's gonna be okay, and they'll do all the right things. And once you kind of realize, sure, he was on the red team, but George W. Bush is one of the worst presidents we've ever had. It was kind of shocking. So to me, I'm somebody that I try to look at issues. I'm still, I would say, conservative at heart, but conservative leaning towards libertarian. And I don't even know where you would put me on that political spectrum anymore, man. I feel very broken and not able to fit in when it comes to that.
Right. Yeah, I know that I'm on a journey that a lot of people are on in their own way, and the political landscape is shifting, and it's perhaps, looking back on it, never been particularly clear why we have these divisions. Well, maybe it is clear. Maybe it's populism versus, well, the enemies of populism, the elites, would have us fighting in these blue and red camps. So that picture is perhaps starting to come into focus for me. How true is that? That's what I want to continue to figure out. But populism is definitely, I think, going to be a theme of the conversation. I think. I wrote this paper. I did take a class in Roman civilization in college. Oh gosh, 11 years ago, and my final, of course, had to do with class divisions and poverty being the wealth gap being a huge issue in ancient Rome. Without jumping into it necessarily on that issue, well, maybe we can. Was poverty and class issue? No, you know what? Let me save that for a second, Jeremy. I'll bookmark that for a second. Let me start with getting to know you just a little bit.
Yeah.
As far as I understand it, your interest in ancient Rome was from a professor you had who got you interested in Alexander the Great, right? Starts with Alexander the Great.
Yeah, I was obsessed with Alexander the Great in undergrad. So I went
Why?
to Seton Hall. I went to Seton Hall here in New Jersey, and I was a double major in undergrad in Torah and also Catholic theology. Two things that you're like, how do those two things go together? I was like, well, I find them interesting. So that was my undergrad degree, but I took every history class having to do with Alexander the Great or the Hellenistic civilization that you could absolutely imagine. And I had the coolest professor, Dr. Sean Lake. We are still friends to this day. We're actually working on a book on Rome that we expect to be out next year. But it was interesting to me because you look at Alexander, and he's this guy that he's a student of Plato. Plato was his teacher, so he was very much this philosopher king type of character, somebody that wants to do the right thing, wants to make the world a better place. But you can kind of see he's on this razor's edge of being an egomaniac, and he tips at a certain point once he ends up in Babylon, and he becomes this crazed egomaniacal, kind of somewhat a philosopher king guy. And Babylon is really this thing that changes him. And he starts to go through this process of, and once again, you have to question, like, did he believe it? But anyway, he starts to portray himself as a god. And he finds these various connections because in Babylon, the King of Kings is seen as a god, right? And the actual worship process is something called proskynesis. Proskynesis, what it actually is you would lay your entire body on the ground in front of the ruler. And he starts making Macedonians do this practice. And people that grew up with him and were in the wrestling schools with him and whatever, like, I grew up with you. This is kind of weird. And it kind of comes to this climax in the last few years of Alexander's life, where he actually kills one of his top generals, a guy named Clytus the Black, for questioning his, that Zeus wasn't his father and his father was actually Philip II. So there's this whole thing of how Alexander flips. Now, Alexander is excellent at either believing it or the use of the propaganda of it, of promoting his own divinity. So I read this really weird article. It's like a one-pager. It was by Dr. Cuthbert Leahy. It was written, or Father Cuthbert Leahy. It was written around the turn of the century, the early 1900s. And Augustus, after he wins the Battle of Actium against Mark Antony in 31 BC, he goes and actually prays in front of the sarcophagus of Alexander. I'm like, that's really weird. Why is he doing that? And then if you look at the early career of Augustus, he looks at a lot of what Alexander did wrong, and he doesn't do those things. But he looks at a lot of what Alexander does right, and he does do those things.
Mm-hmm.
And what he does, he doesn't deify himself during his life. That's going to happen later on. But he does all the right things to create this divine patronage for himself, including, deifying his adopted father, Julius Caesar, after his death, and things such as that, creating the idea of sacrificing to the emperor on his birthday, though he's not an emperor early on. He's what's called a first citizen. So Augustus is this brilliant tactician. I'm like, wow, I want to know how this guy thinks. And it sent me down this path of looking at why do people worship the Roman emperor and what did that worship cult look like? So it's a very indirect way of getting there, but that's how I got there.
Yeah, interesting. So it's a religious study and then a specific interest in worshiping Roman leaders.
Yeah,
was your entry into ancient Rome.
Yeah.
So
and then I started seeing a lot of these modern parallels now, and I'm like, how did people not see this? And then the thing I realized, Brian, is nobody's learned about it at all. Like that's the kind of the major gap.
Right. As much as they say, guys think about ancient Rome every 5 seconds, the reality probably is there's fewer and fewer of those type of guys.
Yes, that's correct.
Right. So with that said, Alexander the Great being the entry point, can you give me a little background on the timeline and culturally the connection or relationship, if there was any, between ancient Greece and ancient Rome?
So if you want to look at the high point of culture, ancient Greece's kind of high point in culture is around the 4th and 5th century BC. So we're talking around 300 or 400 BC. Rome's heyday, the Republic, is kind of like 200 BC to around the Empire falling around 500 AD, right? So we kind of cross over that time period there. So there is a pretty significant gap. Greece is, in some ways, though in some ways they grow concurrently, but if you want to look at who's kind of the older society, it is the Greeks, right? And the Romans early on don't look up to the Greeks because they see their ways as feminizing, but then you're going to see this Hellenizing of Greece that happens, or Hellenizing of Rome that happens, where Hellenizing means the Greek culture coming into Rome. The Greeks would have called themselves Hellenes. And Romans start to really venerate Greek culture. And you're going to have by the early empire, a lot of really well-to-do Romans would have spoken 2 languages, Latin, they would have spoken Greek. So Greece is really this kind of older society. Alexander dies in 323 BC. Augustus doesn't really make his rise until 31 BC, right? So that's almost 300 years in difference. If you read Arrian's Campaigns of Alexander, he talks about one of the plans Alexander had toward the end of his life that he never actually gets to is that he's going to conquer this upstart people called the Romans. He never actually gets to that, but the Romans really were kind of this upstart culture during the time of Alexander.
Interesting. So, man, my next question is about the 3 periods, but I'm interested, what was the culture of the Roman? What was that upstart culture like?
So if you want to, I guess this goes perfectly with the 3 periods. So Rome is really 3 periods in time, and the empire period even breaks down a little bit further than that. But it's a kingdom first, then it's a republic, and then it's an empire. Because I think very often people think of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is kind of the final phase where they take this thing that's big and it gradually gets smaller. But the republic, actually, in terms of growth, is one of the most burgeoning times of like landmass. But if you want to go back early on, the kingdom, there's traditionally 7 kings of Rome, the first of which is Romulus. And if you read the work of Dr. Mary Beard, she'll talk about Romulus of those 7 kings as the least likely to have existed, because he's this guy that Romans don't know how to attribute all these things they do culturally, so they make up this Mr. Rome character, and he probably did it, right? So there's a lot of the early things that Romans couldn't trace, like why do we vote in things called centuries? Why do we have the religious rules we have? They trace a lot of these early things to the kings because they're much harder to trace, and it's kind of more of a traditional thing, if that makes sense. So those 7 kings would be more like warlords. I think they wouldn't be like, having a giant palace and all these things. They would be more similar to like Scotland in kind of the before they get to their William Wallace period. It's just kind of these warlords with these small bands of guys. They had, if you want to look at where they came from, the Romans like to trace themselves from Aeneas, who's one of the heroes of the Trojan War, that basically flees Troy after its fall, comes to an area called Alba Longa, which is in the north and west of Italy. And one of the guys of Romulus and Remus actually come out of this group. There's a whole bigger legend of that, and we can dive into that if you want, but it's kind of long. So that's basically where they trace their culture from, the first king of which is Romulus. And as I said, there's 7 of those traditionally. The last one is Tarquin the Proud, who is killed by a guy named Brutus in 509. Interestingly enough, Brutus is the same guy that'll kill Caesar several hundred years later. And so the Romans say that they became a republic in 509. Now, this goes back to your earlier question, Brian, when you said, well, was it more about money or was it more about class? I think the thing people don't understand about the Roman Republic is it really is more of an oligarchy than an oligarchy of the rich than a republic. And the reason I say that is Rome was broken into what are called centuries for voting blocks. It was called the Centuriate Assembly. And I don't remember the exact number offhand, but I think there's like 180 voting blocks or something like that. We could look this up and figure that out, but there's like 180 voting blocks. Of those 180, 90 are actually owned by the richest 1%. So basically, they could throw the vote for themselves every time because it's the voting classes were actually set up by who owns
it was sufficiently controlled.
Right. It was sufficiently controlled. So to some part, there is representation. To others, there isn't, but it's a representation of the wealthy and those that have money. So in transitioning from a republic to an empire, regular people wouldn't have known that much difference. They probably would have went their whole life without ever seeing an emperor. So for people that didn't have money, their life wouldn't have changed all that much, if that makes sense. But those are kind of your 3 eras in time. You have the kingdom first, then a republic, and then the empire. The empire, Augustus doesn't walk out saying, I'm your emperor. He walks out first saying, well, I'm the first citizen and I want to preserve the republic, and I'm the guy defending it. I'm defending the republic, right? But for some reason, there's only one of me now. And he'll take on a lot of these other military titles later on, the first being first citizen, which is more like the Speaker of the House when it comes to the Roman Senate. So he takes that title of Princeps Senatus, in which he'll shorten to Princeps. It's where we get our modern word prince from, but he'll also pick up the title of Tribune of the People, which there's a whole nother road you could go down of how you could steal power as a tribune, but he'll also take the word imperator, which is kind of the top general of Rome, and that's where we get the title of emperor from, is this idea of imperator.
Okay, so what?
If I get to, I tend to dawdle a little bit, so if that happens, feel free to stop me.
not in any of the shows I've seen you on. So, what were some of the main storylines and key characters from the Republic?
A lot of those are honestly in the late Republic, right? If you want to look at kind of the last, so the Republic goes from 509 to about 31 BC, which interestingly enough, I was writing a post today, BC might be off by about 4 years, but anyway, meaning that a historian in the Middle Ages might have miscalculated by about 4 years. Anyway, that's kind of the Republic era is 509 to 31 BC. You're going to have early in that the Punic Wars, which start to really militarize Rome. There's 3 of those. And that could be more for Rome, like the War on Terror was for America, right? Where we start to kind of militarize the society against an enemy. And what starts to happen then is military power and money become even more important in Rome because guys are raising private armies and things like that in order to actually fight, because you could get power through your military glory. So if you look at the kind of the last 100 years or so, we're talking like 133 to 31, it's what's called the Roman Revolution era. And that era is probably some of the most famous Roman names you could imagine. The 2 brothers first, the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, are these very like populist individuals, and they use this tribune power, right? The tribune of the plebeians are the kind of the poor classes. So the tribune of the plebs would be the person that represented the plebeians. And this would be a way that somebody could skip a lot of the traditional offices you would have to go through to get power was to get this power of the tribune of the plebs. So both of these brothers, one first and then the other one 10 years after, managed to get this office, and both of which are killed for the populist reforms they make. But if you want to look at their reforms, honestly, in some ways they're populist, in some ways they're Marxist. It's very, very interesting. You can kind of dive into this whole thing. But they start to use the power of populism to basically break down the social fabric, right? Because it's very, very interesting how you can do that, right? Like if people realize the person that gives me more stuff is going to be the person that I'm going to put in power, you're going to start to see people use populism to gain power, even if they don't really believe it. So you're going to have these brothers first, the Gracchi brothers. Later on, you're going to have this general named Gaius Marius. And the top office in Rome was something called the consulship. They were 2 every year because they didn't want one man to hold power. Marius holds the consulship 7 times. You were only supposed to hold it once every 10 years. But they use the idea of emergencies. These 2 people specifically, they're going after this general named Jugurtha and this people called the Cimbri. Because of the threat of these 2 things, they have to keep giving Marius power. Well, and that's a real problem, right? Because you're starting to see the way offices work start to break down. And that's kind of the point I'm trying to make here. You're seeing the social fabric and the rule of law start to break down.
Right.
Late in his career, Marius is going to have a disagreement with one of the guys in his army. That's one of his subordinates, a guy named Sulla. And they're going to fight over who's actually going to get the consulship. Sulla ends up getting it, but then the Senate takes it back and gives it to Marius. So then Sulla is actually going to march on Rome and basically with military force take the city and put himself back in charge. And then over a 4-year period, he's going to do what are called proscriptions, meaning if you were an enemy of Sulla, your name went on a list and somebody could bring your head to Sulla and you would get all his stuff. And they would basically be losing their land and things like that as well. So it's kind of chaos of this idea of proscription starting. So we're right around 78 BC when this ends. Sulla relinquishes power, doesn't live that long after. He may or may not have had cancer. We don't know, but he dies toward the end of his proscription.
So you're describing the beginning, the early part of the empire now.
We're not in the empire yet. We're still like 40 years away. We're at 78 BC, right? So we're 78 BC when Sulla relinquishes power. One of the people that's on those consulships is an 18-year-old named Gaius Julius Caesar. He is on these proscriptions lists, and he happens to know some of the right people because Sulla wants him to divorce his wife because he saw the marriage as something that was politically a problem for Sulla. So he says either divorce your wife or you're getting proscribed. Caesar refuses to divorce his wife, and he knows some of the right people. They get him taken off the list. Now, Caesar is a very, very interesting character because he's a very political creature. And the thing that's interesting about Caesar is, people try to make this idea, is he good or is he bad? And I just think he's a very political creature, and he was kind of smarter than most of the people he was working with. He does some very bad things. He definitely does, trust me. But his entire career, he's broke. He has a patrician name, right? So like names mattered. He had the right name, but he never had money. So he was always taking these actions because he had borrowed money or he owed people money. And one of the major people that he owed money to is this guy named Marcus Crassus, who was the richest man in Rome. So Crassus is kind of bankrolling most of Caesar's career. So he's going to first take the religious office of Pontifex Maximus, which is like the top priest of Rome. And then he's going to gradually climb up to 59 BC. He gets finally the office of consul. In that 1 year, he manages to get his colleague shut out. So Caesar's basically ruling by himself, does a lot of populist reforms, and then spends 9 years in Gaul as what's called a proconsul or consul outside of Rome. He kills upwards of 1 million people in those 9 years. Not such a good action, but these are all things that would have been quote unquote glory for Rome. So Romans would have loved it. On his way back,
was he gaining territory during those?
He was gaining what would have been much of Germany and much of France during that time period. A lot of Belgium too. There's a lot of these tribes he's conquering, like the Belgae and others during this time period. So in this 9 years, he conquers a lot of land. Now, on his way back to Rome, he hears through the grapevine that his political enemy, this guy named Cato the Younger, has decided they're going to bring him up on charges for what he had done 9 years before in his year as consul. Because what had ended up happening is there's this idea in Rome that you needed your first year in office to get out of debt, your second year to solidify power, and your third year to avoid prosecution was kind of the idea of getting political office.
Wow.
Caesar didn't have enough years in office in the city of Rome to avoid prosecution. So Cato has this idea of, okay, well, we're going to go after Caesar for his crimes. And Caesar's like, well, what crimes? I didn't commit any crimes. And he decides he's going to run for political office. He's going to run for consul again, because if you're consul, you can't be charged with a crime, right? They can't do that to you. So Rome has a very much in-person political culture. So in order to be voted for, he'd have to show up in Rome. Well, if he shows up in Rome, they're going to arrest him. This is a real problem. So he gets the Roman Senate to approve him to be elected in absentia. Cato then manages to block that with his veto. And once again, we're in the same problem where if you return to the city of Rome, I'm going to arrest you and try you. And that's where the whole idea of crossing the Rubicon comes from. Caesar takes 9 legions, comes through the north of Italy, takes he leaves them at a river in northern Italy, takes 9 of them, crosses the Rubicon, and marches into Rome. The thing that ends up happening at this point, Brian, is his enemies already left. So they just kind of walk in and they're like, hey, Caesar's here. Okay, great. So he's going to take a lot of the treasury money and just give it to the people. And now he's in power. And that kind of ends up being how Caesar gets into power. He ends up getting dictator power. He's named dictator for life in 44 BC, and then he's very quickly assassinated. After that, you're going to have his adopted son, this guy named Gaius Octavius, who's going to later become Augustus, who is trying to avenge his death, take out just about everybody that could be in the way. And then when you kind of get to around 23 BC, Augustus says, okay, I've handled everything. This is the master psychological trick, by the way, because these people have been through civil war for 100 years. What are they going to want? Peace and no war. And what did Augustus just bring them? Peace and no war. He says, I'm going to lay down my power. And they say, no, you have to stay and you have to keep this power. So they actually beg Augustus to stay in power and become what will be their first emperor. So that is how you transition from a republic to an empire. It falls because one man kind of takes all these things that had been breaking down over 100 years and just kind of brings them to a cataclysm at once, and then puts people in such a position that they ask for him to stay. And that is how a republic becomes an empire.
So Octavius is
That was really long-winded. I apologize.
The first Octavius is the first emperor then?
He's the first emperor. People always like to talk about Caesar, Julius Caesar as an emperor, which he never was. He was pretty much the final character of the republic, but he never lives to see an empire.
What a fascinating. So why did the elites hate Caesar? I heard you mention that on another show you did.
Because the thing you have to consider is they hated. So Romans, first of all, as I mentioned, it's a kingdom first, right? So Republicans, Romans hate the idea of kingship. Freudian slip there. Romans hate the idea of kingship. So anyone that seemed like they could be making themselves a king was seen as a real threat. And also anyone that reduced the power of the Senate was seen as a real threat. And Caesar, what he was doing was he was positioning himself so he could become a king. And he was also dramatically reducing the power of the Senate. One of the actions he's actually going to take when he becomes dictator is he enlarges the Senate and then puts his guys in the Senate. So he's reducing the power of the Senate to make them in support of himself. So the thing that's really interesting, because this is going to continue into the empire, is there is this push-pull between the Senate and the emperor as well, because you're going to see there's interestingly enough, a lot of what we perceive to be like terrible emperors, like if you want to say like Caligula, Nero, Domitian, these guys that get a really bad rap, they likely weren't great guys, but they were also some of the major enemies of the Senate. You did not want to cross the Roman Senate for a couple of reasons. Number one, they're the class of people that the people that write the history come from. So how history talks about you is going to come from how the Senate thinks of you. And though the Senate didn't legislate, they had a lot of the monetary power, because all the Senate would do is would make recommendations. It would be to the political offices to actually put things into action. But there is this really hard push between whoever is your monarch character and whoever the Senate is. It's quite interesting.
So during the Republic, the Senate did pass laws, or they just made recommendations?
They never did. The Senate is actually something that comes from the Kingdom of Rome. They would make recommendations to the king, and then the king would decide, I'm going to do this or not do this. During the Republic, it would be the consuls or the tribunes that would pass laws. It would be the Senate
Executive
that would
agencies?
right the Senate that
Um,
would recommend things. Right, like they would say, okay, this is what we recommend that would do, and most times those things would happen. There were it was very rare occasions that the Senate would decide something and that law wouldn't be passed, but it wasn't directly legislating. And they were in certain cases as well, like when Caesar's declared an enemy of Rome by the Senate, and they want to send Pompey out after him. They'll pass the senatorial consultum ultimum, which is kind of this idea of, okay, this person has the ultimate power of the Senate. Go get the guy who's the enemy of Rome. But very other than that specific action, it was only a recommendation of laws.
Got it. So life for the average citizen wasn't much different, you said, between the Republic and the Empire?
It really wouldn't have been, because if you were in some of these, plebeian and lower classes, because sure, plebeian is the lower class, but there were a lot of people that didn't even have any money, and their life wouldn't have changed that dramatically. Now, here's something that is interesting. One of the reforms, if you ever get a chance to read about it, the reforms that Caesar does in his first 6 months in office are actually pretty interesting. One of which is he reforms the calendar, which was missing 30 days. So every couple of years, they'd have to add a month to make it make sense. He also, the Gracchi brothers had started this idea of the grain dole, basically giving grain to every person in Rome to make sure no one went hungry, which is something later on that's actually going to help to bankrupt the empire. But Caesar takes that process and standardizes it and makes it work a lot better, because what had happened is people had kind of figured out how to rig the system and control who was getting grain and how. So Caesar actually manages to take this system and make sure that people actually needed it got it. But for the most part, their life would have been, there's a quote from, I think it's John Locke, that says life is nasty, brutish, and short. And that pretty much would have been how your average Roman's life would have been. It would have been hard work, and things such as that. Now, in the late Empire, this is where you start to see people that get stuck in like certain jobs. Like, I was a blacksmith, my father's a blacksmith, things like that. People in the Republic and in the early Empire, if they were in the moneyed classes, had a lot of social mobility. But for your average person, their life would not really have changed from the Republic to the Empire. They likely would have never even seen their emperor.
So I'm interested in this grain thing. So what was the motivation behind this? Were these guys, these brothers, just progressive, wealthy guys?
So I always confuse which of these was first. I think it was Gaius Gracchus that was the first one, and then Tiberius Gracchus came after him. So if I'm wrong on this, please don't axe me here, guys. But anyway, the older of the two brothers actually fought in the Punic Wars, and on his way back from Carthage to Rome, he's going through a lot of this farmland. And what had happened is really wealthy people had managed to figure out how to take public lands, even though it was public lands, and use it for their own vineyards and farms and things like that. And what was happening is, because of that, there was no land for regular people to farm on. So two of the major reforms of the Gracchi brothers are, number one, they want to take some of this public land and give it to soldiers that come back for war, because a lot of times the way war worked in the ancient world is it wasn't really, and when I say the ancient world, I'm talking about like kind of early in the Roman Republic. It's going to change in the late Republic, but what would happen period is these guys would go to war, they would come back, and a couple things would happen. Number one, if they had a family farm, they likely wouldn't own it anymore because they'd been gone for so many years. They hadn't paid the taxes, hadn't produced on it. They'd lost it and they didn't know it. So they'd come, and the second thing that would happen is they'd come back and they'd have no way to pay for anything. So now you had a bunch of these people that had just fought for their country and conquered all this land and created all this wealth, and they had nothing, and they'd come back to nothing. So the Gracchi brothers want to basically do what are called agrarian reforms or farming reforms. They wanted to take these public lands, not all of them, but a percentage of them, and give them to soldiers returning from war. The problem is a lot of the senatorial classes had just kind of like, even though they didn't own it, just set up shop on it and just started like building farms. So that's kind of one major problem. And then because of that as well, the shortage of farmland, there's a shortage of food to feed people. So the two major reforms are this grain dole, and then also these agrarian reforms for what are we going to do with farms. So those are kind of the two major things. And believe it or not, these agrarian reforms are something that are very long lived, because that's also going to be something that Caesar is still trying to pass in 59 BC. This is all the way from 133. So this is a real theme. And it is actually something that Caesar is going to get done, believe it or not, in his year in 59 BC as consul. He won't. What he wants to get done is not part of it done, but he's the first one to actually like accomplish some of this land redistribution.
Interesting. So for the people who might have been affected, maybe the upper class, this might be a funny question, but which period was better for those people, the Republic or the Empire?
Oh, that's tough. Because it also, like, you have to understand Rome as a system. The Roman civilization, I guess is the way we'll put it, had something which is called a patronage system. And it's the same thing in the Republic, and it's the same thing in the Kingdom, and it's the same thing in Empire. And that's something that doesn't change. The patronage system would be, so Brian, let's say you're a really wealthy guy. You are Publius Cornelius Escrow, right? You're very rich, very wealthy. And because of that, you start to develop what are called clients, because you have money, you have political office, so people want favors from you. And these people start to become your clients, and they'll do different things for you because, you might recommend them to an office, or you might help them get a job, or you might do these different things to them. So Rome had a very strong client system. Now, the thing that's interesting about that is you could see some of that in modern day, right? Where maybe you owe something to this person or whatever. But in modern day, I think there's still a lot of people that might decide, I need you to know you need this thing, but I'm not going to do it. The thing that's interesting in the Roman era is they felt like they were indebted by honor to do this thing. And if they did not, they would lose class position. They would lose all the different things. So being and doing what their patron needed, they had to do it. Like it was a very enforced thing. So this system doesn't change from the kingdom to the republic to the empire. It just depended on who were you a patron of, right? There's a really interesting series, if you get a chance to watch it, on I think it's on Paramount or one of those. It's called For Those About to Die. Anthony Hopkins is in it. Okay. And if you really want to understand it, they show you kind of the life of the Emperor Domitian. And they show you Domitian taking on clients and what that system would have been like. So it's a very, very interesting system, because if your person you're a client of has more political power, well, that was more beneficial to you. If they were in a certain like way of work, like maybe they're in masonry, well, that might be more beneficial to you if, like, let's say you're planning things. So the client system is something that doesn't change. And it's something that for the money classes, if you had the right patron, it wouldn't matter if you were in a republic or an empire or whatever it might be, because the patron system was what mattered to you, less than who was in political power.
So money made the world go round, no matter what.
Made the world go round, man.
So for what reason is it important to even consider the differences in a republic versus an empire? Does it even matter?
In some ways, yes, it does, because it matters. I'm trying to figure out how to explain this. It matters in, first of all, the structure, right? Like it matters because what starts to happen is as power starts to centralize in Rome, which it's going to do from the Republic to the Empire, a lot of the actions of that one person in power are the things that cause it to break down, if that makes sense. Because if you look at kind of the policies of that emperor, can often be on whims or different ideas, and those policies changing so dramatically or done incorrectly cause a problem. If you want to look at Rome is at its highest extent in 117 AD under the Emperor Trajan. And Trajan is the second of what's known as the five good emperors. The last of those is Marcus Aurelius. The thing that they do that's different is before that, the Julio-Claudians are kind of the first dynasty of Rome, and then kind of the dynasty in between them and the five good emperors, who's the dynasty of Domitian and Titus and all of those guys as well, the Flavians. The things they had done is they would have their son be the next person. And Augustus is an interesting case too, being the first guy, because everybody around him seems to die, so he keeps adopting sons. And eventually he ends up on Tiberius, who's this guy he really doesn't want, but he's kind of the last one left standing. But they end up taking their next of kin that's still living and making the next emperor. And that's very, very hit or miss, because you could get somebody that's very qualified, very unqualified. You're going to have guys like Caligula and Nero that absolutely bankrupt the country by their spending. You're going to have so the five good emperors are different because and people have batted back on me on this, and in some ways they're correct. For the most part, these guys didn't have natural born sons. But at the same time, they were smart enough to find the person most qualified around them to be the next emperor. So you have this really solid succession for five emperors, and it's kind of the most stable time period in Rome. After that, you're going to have Marcus Aurelius that says, I know I'm this great Stoic. I know I'm supposed to be really smart, but I'm going to name my spoiled young kid the next emperor. And that's how you get Commodus. And Edward Gibbon, in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, likes to point Commodus as kind of that first point where Rome's decline starts. Because what ends up happening then is Commodus is killed in 193. They try several times to kill him, by the way. And then he finally gets strangled to death. They apparently weren't very good at killing him. What's going to happen then is it's going to be a change from kind of this political power to military power. And then it ends up being whoever has the biggest army, the most soldiers, and the most money who can be emperor. So you have military commanders that start raising money and raising armies and calling themselves emperor. So then what happens, right? If that's your policy is going to be everything to feed that army. You're going to bring in barbarian tribes from outside of the country to serve in that army. Now, the Romans had always done that to an extent, but never to the extent that starts after Septimius Severus in 193. You start really seeing this army be fed by more barbarian soldiers. And the thing that starts to happen is Severus in 193 is one of the first ones to say, okay, well, if you really want to fight in my army, how about I double your pay? And then how about I triple your pay? So what starts to happen? Major inflation starts to happen. And by 284 AD, inflation's at 15,000%. 15,000%. And in the 270s, the silver coin is actually bronze. It doesn't have any silver in it. So this is the problem you're going to have by kind of this one person rule. And in some ways, Brian, like this is part of the problem we're seeing here in America, right? And I say that because what we're supposed to have three co-equal branches of government. And what's happened since the Second World War is the presidency has gained more and more and more and more power. And you can look at this by the number of executive orders and things like that have happened. So now we're very dependent on how good is the guy we elected to be in office. And that's a real problem because that's not how our system was set up, right? And I think as much as I like Trump, you look at the number of executive orders he's done, and you look at the number of executive orders Biden's done and Obama's done and Bush has done. It really started with Bush, kind of this extremeness of executive orders or using executive power to wield what the legislative branch won't let you do. So I think this is the problem. The major problem we're seeing is no matter who's in power, it's becoming more of an imperial presidency.
Yeah, you just made a great connection for me because through hosting this podcast for several years now and going to law school, I realized that, yeah, absolutely. The executive branch is way more important than it was intended to be by the people who set up the government. That's a fact. And so if one of the lessons maybe from studying Rome is that the centralization of power can lead to the militarization of society, the fracturing, and then you got to start paying all these.
Well, even just that we become too dependent on the actions of one person, right? You get what I'm saying? Like sure. It's why the Republic works so well. They were two consuls every year, and they changed every year. So you were much more dependent on what was going to happen over a time period rather than what's going to happen right now in this year. It's why the Chinese are so successful. Not that I like China. I think communism in China is a bad thing, but at the same time, it's why the time is called the epic times, because China thinks in epochs. They think in long time periods. Where here in the US, we're just thinking about the next election and who's the next guy we're going to get in there to have imperial power.
So the fall of Rome, we're talking about the end of the Roman Empire, the end of the last phase. And so I've heard you say that the exact date is one of the most hotly contested things in history. Is that true?
It is. That's true.
Why is that true? Or why?
Because it depends on which historians you're reading. There's some people. So 476 A.D. is considered to be the traditional end of the Roman Empire. Now, the thing you have to consider is the Byzantine Empire in the East wouldn't have called itself the Byzantine Empire. They start calling it that in the 16th century after it's already gone. They would have called themselves Romans. So that ends in 1453. Now, it's much smaller in 1453 than it is in the year 1000, thanks to the I think it's the Third Crusade, where the Crusaders decide they're going to sack Constantinople too. But what ends up happening, that doesn't fall to 1453. So there's a lot of people that say, well, Roman Empire was still going in 1453. There's other ones that try. There's some really fun ones around this too. There's people that are like, America is the fourth Rome and has never ended. Or there's the people that say, Charlemagne in 800, the Holy Roman Empire was the continuation of the empire, which was really just an attempt of the papacy to grab more political power. So if you just want to look at when did the Western Empire stop functioning, it pretty much was around this 476 date. Now, how it fell is so much different as well, because I think people like to. Have you ever seen the paintings of the fall of Rome, where everything's on fire and there's naked people running around and stuff like that? There's different ones.
I don't think I've seen the paintings.
If you get a chance, look up Fall of Rome in Google Images, and you'll see some very interesting paintings. What actually happens is, yes, Rome is sacked in 410. Different things happen, but at the same time, Rome starts to become less Roman, and as the currency is kind of dying, you don't have an empire when you don't have a currency anymore. And what ends up happening is kind of the last 100 years of the Roman Empire, you have a lot of child emperors, and your final one, and by barbarian kings in a lot of ways, barbarian warlords, which are going to become kings. The final of which is this guy named Romulus Augustulus. He's deposed by this barbarian named Odoacer, who's going to name himself the first king of Italy. And that's how the Roman Empire falls. There is no great battle. There is no whatever it might be. It's basically they retire this teenager who's on the throne and not actually running anything with any political power. And he says, I'm going to show you guys what's been happening behind the curtain for years. I've been in charge. And you get your first king of Italy, this guy Odoacer, by him basically just deposing the teenage Roman emperor, and he doesn't kill him or anything. They give him a pension. They give him a place to retire in Ravenna. So it's a really kind of anticlimactic way for the Roman Empire to end. Now, why do we hear about it ending in the way it ended? Because in the 5th century, Justinian, who's the Eastern Roman emperor, wants to rule over a united empire. So what does he do? Him and his general Belisarius try to reconquer Rome and bring it back. And trying to put it back together, they break it apart.
This is
again.
after they retired, after the barbarian kings declared themselves.
Yes, we're going to be in a later king on this too. They're going to be under the king Theodoric, who's a bunch of years after Odoacer. Justinian and his general Belisarius are going to attack Rome and try and reunite it with the Eastern and Western Empire.
I see, and that was a fiery spectacle.
Yeah, that was definitely a fiery spectacle.
And so that's what gets all the attention. But they don't necessarily say that it was really Justinian's fault.
Well, would your scribes want you to look bad, Brian?
Right.
I think they'd want you to look good.
I would fire them right away if they even had that instinct. So,
and that's something you have to consider, by the way, in history and where it's being written from is, where's the political power, where's the money, right? Like if you were an all powerful ruler and I'm writing on your side of the fence, well, I'm probably going to make you look good.
Yeah, editing matters. So inflation and immigration are cited as the two main reasons for when we say the fall. Then I guess the story I can play for myself is Rome was sacked by barbarian invaders, and from that point on they had child emperors in name only, and eventually it became official. So if that's what the fall was, then
it's a whole lot more complicated than that. And I know I definitely like to simplify it and say it's for inflation and immigration, because if you want to look at it, those really are the two things. But in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon gives like 200 different reasons. And he puts a lot of onus on Christianity, which I really don't agree with. And you have to understand Gibbon's background. Gibbon was raised Catholic. but then later in life becomes a Protestant because in order to have the right political office in England in that point in time, you had to be a Protestant. So he's going to take a really hard hit at the papacy because he wants to look good. I actually don't agree with a lot of his ideas on like he thinks that basically Christianity had like softened the empire and things like that. I don't see it. I don't see it because if you want to look at if that was true, then the Eastern Roman Empire wouldn't exist and wouldn't exist for another 1,000 years. That's why I just think he's choosing which history he's going to look at. Now, I think the thing that you do need to look at is the 3rd century, though Rome doesn't fall in the 3rd century, is what kills Rome. Because what ends up happening, as I mentioned, after the death of Commodus in 193, you're going to have what start to be called barrack emperors. The idea of military barracks is these guys that are ruling that didn't have the right political clout or didn't have the right political experience to be emperor. They just had the biggest army and the most money. So you have in this time period, I think in the 3rd century, there's something around like 49 different people that claim to be emperor during this time period. And you're going to have most emperors do not die of natural causes. So they're going to have very short rules. A lot of guys claim to be emperors. So in the 3rd century, the empire starts to break up. You're going to have a break-off empire in the east. A Roman general called Postumus breaks off part of the Roman Empire for himself called the Gallic Empire. You're going to have another empire breaks off in the east called the Primarian Empire. And then you have from the north, the Huns start to come in. So you have the empire is starting to break down purely because nobody's running it. All these guys are fighting about who gets to run it. Now, if we had the same type of political power you'd had in the 2nd century, they probably could have survived that, no problem. But then this breakdown starts to happen. Then how do you solve the breakdown? You bring in more soldiers, you pay them more, you do all these different things. And they're fighting about who gets to control it, not about who's going to stop the outside forces from coming in. Because the outside forces throughout Rome's history had been a problem. But because they're, number one, not paying attention to them. And number two, they're making deals with them they're not keeping. They're saying, okay, you can settle within our borders, we'll give you some food and whatever it might be, and then not keeping those agreements. So that's part of the problem that's happening. So they're creating an enemy for themselves, if that makes sense.
From within.
So if you handle this central power issue, and if you handle immigration and money, you're in much better shape. But the fact that they weren't paying attention to, I guess, all being on the same page politically and worrying about their borders rather than they're worrying about who is in charge, that's what kills things, man. It's really what kills things.
So internal political divisions, a lack of a political structure, it devolves, and that is a huge factor.
Yes. Well, because
and we have a loss of political. We just have less political talent in this time.
That's one of the things that Gibbon hits on, which I do think is correct. Because if you want to look at it as well, Aurelian in the 270s he gets the name of this Restutor Orbum, or restorer of the world, because he brings that Gallic Empire back into Rome. He brings the Palmyran Empire back into Rome. He pushes off the northern invaders, and he puts this entire thing back together. There is a restored empire under Aurelian in the 270s. And how do they reward him? His secretary kills him. And this ends up being something that happens, is you get somebody that's actually qualified, actually achieves, actually puts the thing back together, and somebody kills him. So it's kind of this loss of people that are qualified to actually run the thing, because the ones that are qualified have to constantly be watching their back. And by the time you get to what was the name of it? Was the guy that takes over for Aurelian? The Roman emperor Tacitus. He has the same name. He's in the same family as the historian Tacitus. He's a senator that they want to make emperor, and he's older, so they see him as less threatening. And he says, no, please don't make me emperor. I don't want to be emperor. Because in that point in time, becoming an emperor was a death sentence. He doesn't rule very long. I think it's like several months that he's going to end up being emperor. But it becomes a job that people don't want at a certain point, because you don't live very long and you're not able to put the thing back together. And if you do, they reward you by killing you anyway.
Yeah, one of my most frequent guests, a friend of mine, this guy Herbie K, he's got this interesting idea. He wrote a book called Anti-Politism while he was in jail for awful financial crimes. I mean, he's open about it. He's, not a perfect person for sure. But while reflecting in jail, he wrote a few books. One of them is Anti-Politism, and the core idea is to go from an election system to a lottery system. And the reason behind a qualified lottery system, the reason is that he said only a sociopath would run for office these days. The scrutiny you have to get subjected to. So by changing the entire structure of how we choose our leaders, he would say we can get better people in. But he agrees, and many people that I've spoken to agree, that we have a problem with getting normal, good, healthy, qualified people. So that's not good.
Well, and I think if you look at it as well, like that is part of the problem, Brian. Like look at how many of our politicians are owned by someone else or whatever it might be. So you have people, quote unquote, making decisions for your country which aren't in your best interest, it's in their best interest. And that breaks down a political system. And now we have people pouring across the borders. We're spending money we don't have. Like, I get it that, they're not raising armies against each other and attacking each other, but history doesn't repeat, it rhymes in a lot of ways. And unless we handle borders and unless we handle currency, even Trump can't put this thing back together. I think that is the actual problem. And the problem with that too is, I think if you expect him to put it back together himself without the Supreme Court and not the legislative branch, well, is this America anymore?
Right. So understanding that there could easily be up to 200 different factors, I think regarding inflation and immigration, I think I get inflation. You don't want to have hyperinflation. That would be a disaster.
Right.
And maybe the implication for today is, hey, maybe we should switch to a gold back or some sort of hard currency. The bringing it to our world would be fiat currency, may be a big problem in that regard. Do I have that right?
You do, and the problem is, like, Dr. Ron Paul talks about this, that which, by the way, I don't know if you saw a funny one. There was a meme on Twitter the other day that said I couldn't think if I wanted to put an angel or a star on top of my Christmas tree, so I did both, and I put a picture of Ron Paul on top. Anyway, he talks
funny.
about the person that reforms currency is not going to be very popular, because what's going to happen, Brian, is we're so far over our skis with how much money we've spent that it's initially going to be extremely painful. It's going to be extremely painful to get back on something that's a hard currency, because we've spent so much more than what our currency is worth. So I think that's one thing you have to consider. But I think something that does not get enough attention and isn't looked at enough, when people talk about Constantine, they often talk about him being the first Christian emperor as being his real claim to fame, which he was. But the thing that he does not get credit for is he handles currency reforms that have been tried several times before him. Aurelian tries to reform the currencies in the 270s, in the 280s and early 300s. Diocletian tries to reform the currencies and fails. And when the currency reforms don't work, he tries to put in price controls, which really doesn't work because it drives a black market and drives inflation harder. What Constantine does is he starts to take possession of these pagan temples, and he starts having conquests again, because after 117, Rome wasn't really conquering any land anymore. They were just kind of like holding the territory they had. And in 314, in a city called Trier in Germany, he mints less than 100 gold coins. And what he's going to do every year until he dies, in the 330s, is mint more gold coins. By the time he dies, the Eastern Empire is on a gold standard. That gold standard is going to go until about the year 1000 without inflation. So it can be done, but it has to be done gradually. And it's something that, for some reason, it's not talked about enough with Constantine, but until it goes from around 314 to 1000 without inflation, because he there's a lot of different things he does in addition to minting the currency, right? He demands people pay their taxes in that gold currency. He basically gets that gold currency moving around in trading, because what had happened previously is other currencies were losing so much value that people would hoard gold. But he standardizes the gold currency, and that's one of the major things that keeps the East so profitable.
Okay, so making sure inflation doesn't get out of control is the big picture there, right?
We're already there, so now we got to figure out how to backtrack it.
Okay, but we're not quite to where they were.
No, we're not at that. No, not at all.
Right, but it's
concerning. But I think
Argentina
is a great example of that. Argentina is a great example of that, though, because I think the last reporting I saw, they were at like 17,000%. When Milei first took office, and if you look at the amount he's reduced it by, it's kind of insanity.
Yeah, no, he's a fascinating figure, and I'm going to be following his career closely. I mean, my goodness, fascinating guy. So, if that's inflation, talk me through immigration. What was the problem with immigration in Rome?
Well, the major problem is like, and this is something I would say here in America is people that don't have like a cultural buy-in. Now, does that mean that everybody has to be a white Anglo-Saxon? No, it doesn't mean that. What I mean is when people come into a country and they assimilate into that country, what had
Hmm.
started to happen is a lot of these tribes were just settling within the empire, and you have to understand part of how we got here too. Is in 212, Caracalla realizes he's bankrupted the empire. So what are you going to do with a bankrupted empire? Well, you got to get more money. So how do you do that? All the people that are living within the empire that aren't Roman, give them citizenship, because if you give them citizenship, you can now tax their inheritance. So he figures this is a way to get money back.
Mm.
So that's one of the major issues is you have people coming in that are taking part in the welfare system, and this is where the grain dole comes back into play, because one of the things that allows the Roman Empire to rise is something called the Roman climate optimum. That it was basically from around 200 BC to around 300 AD. There's this perfect time period for growing things in all of the land Rome conquers, and it allows them to feed a lot more people that can be fed directly before that or directly after that. And the way they would do that in the empire versus the republic is once they take over Egypt after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, Egypt kind of becomes the breadbasket of the empire. And the way that would happen is every year the Nile River would flood and then it would recede. And the flood water would make this really rich, fertile land that would grow all the grain that would feed the rest of the empire.
Hmm.
Around the 250s AD, that stops happening every year and it starts happening every few years. And what happens is grain prices double and triple and quadruple. Well, and Rome has this policy of feeding everyone, right? So now it's getting more and more and more expensive to feed people coming into this empire. And that's a real problem. And you have to consider as well, now you have people fighting in your army that they're in it just for the money, man. When the money doesn't have any value anymore, well, who are they going to fight for? The next person that has the money or power. So it's kind of this double-edged sword that creates. Do you get where I'm going? This is a double-edged
Yeah.
sword that kind of creates holding something together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So the immigration problem was cultural. It was a breakdown culturally.
Cultural, but also power structure, right? Because like a lot of these guys, specifically for army, were brought in just to fight.
I see.
So
Gotcha.
you'd have guys fighting for a Roman general that if they stopped paying him would be fighting for a barbarian warlord the next year.
Okay.
There is no real loyalty. Like they
So it was
weren't
a
in it
further
because like
breakdown of the power structure,
correct.
which
Like
you
they're
could
not
you
like
could
I'm Roman, I'm doing this, you know?
right. Right. That's interesting. Yeah, no, I understand people today with immigration to the extent that you want to say, hey, we should have reasonable expectations for assimilation. Sure. I mean, of
Mm.
course, that's completely reasonable. I mean, I come from the background of studying critical race theory in my final year of law school over 2 classes and was kind of horrified by what I learned. And really, I mean, that's really what got me on this journey. And I
Well,
found
and you have
myself,
to
go ahead. Go
sorry,
ahead.
Brian. No, I thought you were done talking. Go ahead.
No. And I began to say to myself, wow, I feel like I identify more with the Ted Cruz, the Ron DeSantis types in the way these people view America. So if it were a cultural thing with the immigration in Rome, but it sounds like it was more political power, further breakdown.
Yeah, and it's it's the interesting thing too, Brian, is I think like once again I don't understand how to politically classify myself because I think we can go too far onto like, you know, you have to be a white Anglo-Saxon Christian, blah
Sure,
blah blah, to be an American.
exactly.
And I'm not 100% in agreement with that. Like I think if you're culturally deciding to be American and you're going to contribute to this country and you're going to you know, handle things
Yeah,
here and take care
here's
of our
here's
laws, I
where I
think that's
am.
one part of it. Yeah, it's
When I
but if you look at a lot of people on my side, they're like, "That's terrible. Why would you say that?" And I'm like, "But it's like I don't know, man. I don't fit anywhere."
No, here's where I stand. I'm the only
Yeah.
place I'm really comfortable talking about anything politically is this cultural war stuff because I did take these classes.
Yeah.
I certainly found myself not agreeing with the far left view, but I certainly don't agree with the Nick Fuentes far right view that you have to be
That's
white
the
to be
point
in
I'm
America.
making.
It's and it's an easy answer, and this is why I say I totally understand the arguments about assimilation. It's a question of assimilation, and that means accepting and acknowledging that the system that we have does come from a white people system. Okay. Like
Right.
we didn't inherit a government from Africa. It's just not what happened. And so we
Right.
modify it, you improve it, but you have to acknowledge the base, and the base is our rights and the structure. And
Well, and that's where you get like Dearborn, Michigan's a real problem, like because you have places cops won't even go and that are trying to not follow American law, and that's
right.
insane. Like how do
Yeah.
we get around that? You know?
So you can understand for sure the concerns from people on the right and even the far right about culture, but you can go too far, and there's a line there for sure.
Yeah. Well, and I think just to add to that too, and bring this back to Rome, like the famous sack of Rome in 410, sack meaning attack and like kind of taking all the good stuff, like all the gold and valuables, is done by this Visigoth commander named Alaric. Alaric, before being that Visigoth commander, he'd always been a Visigoth. Visigoth just means West Goth, by the way. There's the Ostrogoths that are the East Goth, and the Visigoths are the West
What are the
Goths.
Goths? What are the Goths?
They're just like one of the smaller breakdowns of barbarian people. Like there's
Okay.
hundreds of them we can go into and what lands they're from and everything else. But I guess just to keep it simple, Visigoth is an East Goth. Ostrogoth is a West Goth.
Okay.
Anyway,
It'd be so much easier if they just said East Goth. I mean, my God.
And it's the Rhine River is the dividing point. But anyway, he had previously been a Roman commander, right? Like he had fought for the Romans and led Roman troops. And then eventually, like when he's not feeling he gets paid well enough, he just goes back to the Goths and attacks Rome to get some money. So this is the thing you start to have breaking down in this kind of last, 100 to 150 years.
Got it. Can I ask you some quick questions that my friends wanted me to ask you?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, cool. And I don't expect you to go into any great length.
Yeah, if I don't know the answer, I will be honest.
Yeah. And if you don't know the answer, just say, yeah, pass. All right. My best friend Ben and his brother Matt actually both have a couple questions. And they love this stuff, so they were excited. Ben asks, who are the top 3 greatest Romans?
Oh man. It depends if it gets great from what perspective, right? Like if you want to look at Augustus created something that lasted 500 years, and in the East lasts even longer. So people would see him as one of the greatest Romans, right? I had to pick 5.
No, 3.
3. Okay, I was gonna say 5's a lot. Scipio Africanus is one of the big ones because he's the kind of the hero that ends the Punic Wars. He's the guy that beats. So he's I guess you could say he's one of your. The Romans also would have seen him as one of their greatest.
What were the Punic Wars, by the way?
The Punic Wars, Punes are what the Romans would have called the North Africans from Carthage. So they're called the Punic Wars because of the wars against the Punes, or the wars from the North Africans. And that starts in a really strange way, by the way, that the island of Syracuse, which is off the coast of Italy, was kind of a trading center for the Carthaginians. And they decide that they don't want to be a trading center for the Carthaginians anymore. They just want to do their own thing. But they ask the Romans to come help them. So the Romans are like, sure, we'll come help you. So they attack the Carthaginians for them. And that kind of like starts a whole bunch of different stuff going off. And then there's 3 different wars, which take place over, about 100 years. So it becomes kind of this militarization against Rome, against the Carthaginians, to the point that Cato the Elder will end every speech with Carthago delenda est, or Carthage must be destroyed, even if it had nothing to do with Carthage. I could just imagine him being like, and we're going to get more land and we're going to have a great day, and Carthago delenda est, like always ending a speech with Carthage must be destroyed.
Make America great again. And Carthage must. So,
well, and even as well, so in that time, the way the sea battles would go in kind of the early Carthaginian wars, is they would have this, this, like, I don't know if you call it like a bumper, like a pole in the front of the boats, and the boats kind of crash into each other. It was called a rostra. And what happens is, when Romans beat these Carthaginian boats, they'd take the rostra back to Rome and they put it on the speaker's platform, to the point that after the Carthaginian wars, the speaker's platform ends up being called the rostrum, because it actually gets the name from, they used to take the rostra and stick it on the front of the speaker's platform.
Wow, amazing. So we have Augustus, the first emperor. We have a general that was key to,
and Romans would have seen him as like kind of like the grandest of Romans,
Oh wow,
Scipio Africanus, Publius
gotcha,
Cornelius Scipio Africanus.
got it.
And if we want to pick another one, could pick an emperor, because often Hadrian is seen as one of the best emperors, but then again, it depends who you ask. But he's one of the better emperors for culture in Rome, and he's one of the
Mm.
few that's going to be like actually he spends very little time in Rome, and he actually travels around the entire empire to try and make sure things are going well and things are kind of staying together. So he's a very interesting character, loved by some, hated by others. Once again, an enemy of the Senate. So what are you going to do?
Is there any politician who is universally loved really throughout the history?
Well, I think some could say he's
Right,
tremendous. No, I
right,
don't.
yes,
I don't really think so, man.
right.
In postscript, because even George Washington, they're like, oh well, he owned slaves, they hate him. So it's like, you know what I mean?
Right.
It's like I don't know that there's
Right.
anybody
He's
that's universally like,
probably and I was really just even thinking within Rome, but
yeah.
yeah, George would probably be as close as it gets, right? But with the cultural
Well, if you want to
breakdown,
say
right,
universally in Rome, everyone would have loved Romulus. And he may not even have been real, but he was kind of this
interesting.
ideal of who was the ideal Roman. Well, that would be Romulus. And if you even look at
Interesting.
how coinage is kind of an interesting it's an interesting propaganda piece, right? Because if you think of the purpose of coins, the original purpose of coins was to pay the military, right? So if your face was on a coin, they knew you were the person paying them. Now it's going to start to be used in trading and other things, but the purpose of it is to pay the military. And you can tell how weak or how strong an emperor is because of who he positions himself with. If he's not so strong, he's going to put Augustus on one side and his own face on the other, or Romulus on one side and his own face on the other, because he wants you to think of the person you would think is strongest with himself,
Mhm.
even if he's not. And it's like the final emperor. Why the final emperor has the name Romulus Augustus. We took the
Mm.
two best names and stuck them together for the last guy because he's so great, he's terrible.
Well, that's really interesting. So Romulus was to represent this ideal Roman character. What are the characteristics of this ideal Roman person? Like, who is that person?
He's strength. He's someone that creates the thing. He's the person they culturally look up to. Now, if you want to look at who is the ideal Roman, the ideal Roman that's always seen this way is this guy named Cincinnatus. And George
Mhm.
Washington is called the American Cincinnatus for a lot of this reason. But Cincinnatus, once again, may or may not have existed. We don't know. But he's
Mm.
seen as a gentleman farmer type that war breaks out, and he serves in the Roman army and leads troops, and he takes this office called the dictator. The dictator is someone that has absolute power for a period of 6 months. Now that definition is going to lose its 6-month thing much later on, but the idea is he leads for dictatorship for 6 months, he solves the problem, relinquishes power, and goes back to farming. And for the Romans, that is seen as ideal. Someone that does what is their duty to Rome, solves the
Mhm.
situation, and lays down their power. Romans would have seen that as the ideal.
Fascinating. Okay, I'm going to skip what caused the fall of the Roman Empire. I think we talked about that.
that was pretty intense.
Yeah, you don't mind if we skip that one, do you?
That's fine.
What is Roman society's greatest achievement?
Wow.
Isn't that a good one?
It's a good one. I guess the thing you have to consider is you could see Roman society being the precursor to European culture. So I think if you want
Mm.
to look at it this way, it's kind of the creation of a large universal culture. It hadn't really been done on the scale and in the way that the Romans had done it before. And that is in my opinion, there's so many other things you could look at, and there's pluses and minuses, but there had never been a culture of millions of people doing the same thing at the scale that the Romans had it at the time that they had it. So I think that's pretty interesting. And most European culture comes out of what the Romans left behind.
Was there tremendous ethnic diversity within this Roman culture that was doing the same thing at the same time, or was it fairly homogeneous?
So what would you have to look at how the empire changes over time. So early on, the Romans had this strategy of allyship, right? Like if they come in and they conquer your territory, they don't want your money, they don't want your taxes, they want troops and they want you to serve in their army. And that's the thing that allows them to expand early on. So they start to bring a lot of different groups and people into this empire, into this area. Later on, taxes start to become a thing, and they're going to care less about your troops and care more about your money. But you're going to see places in North Africa that you can go look at these, ruins that are left, and they're Roman. You could go to places in the Balkans, and they're very Roman. And you have kind of in this early empire, as I mentioned, the empire breaks down into two states. The early empire from 31 BC until about 284 is called the Principate, or it's somebody ruled by a prince, or the princeps. And it is, sure, it's authoritarian, but it would have been closer to a republic than an empire. Now, the 284 to 476 is what's called the Dominate, or somebody ruled by a dominus, or a lord. And that's started by a guy named Diocletian, who's the model of medieval kingship. So if you want to look at places that are in this Principate time period, they would have assimilated and become Roman. And this would have been very important to them. And they would have taken pride in the citizenship they earned. They would have taken pride in the different things they earned. So there are many emperors that weren't even Italian, right? You look at Hadrian that I mentioned, he was he was a Spaniard in that time period, and one of the first to have a beard. Or you look at Septimius Severus. He wasn't black, but he would have been darker skinned, and he was from North Africa. So you start to have a you know what I mean? And it's
its own thing. It became a thing, and they spread it like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah, like Serbia, believe it or not, has a significant amount of Roman emperors that come from Serbia. The Balkans is kind of a hotbed for Roman culture, which is very, very interesting. So it does bring and assimilate a lot of these different cultures, but they become Roman, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and people will have differing views on the pros and cons of centralization of culture, or even if not power. So it's very interesting. I got you. Okay, getting to some of the last questions here. I so appreciate your time. This has been amazing.
Yeah, you got it, man.
What was the daily day-to-day? Oh, we already touched upon that. Daily life.
Yeah, and it would have been different based on who you are.
Right. So if you're a pleb, it was hard, brutish, likely.
Well, and if you were a client of someone, you would have showed up at their house every day and asked what they wanted. That's basically how it would work.
Right. Fighting to survive any way you can. The pretty way or the hard way. Got it. Let's see. And then he asked what they ate daily. This guy's into nutrition. What were their food staples?
I don't know a ton of that, honestly. No. I look at more political and social history.
Okay. And his second part to that last question was, what were the biggest holidays and what was it like to be part of the festivities? Anything on that?
I got myself in trouble on this one recently because I talked about how Christmas goes in with this stuff and blah blah blah.
Yeah, let's not. Would you rather not touch it? Let's skip that.
No, it's just because what happens is I think people have to understand is it's a polytheistic culture, right? So you would have kind of the traditional Roman god pantheon, right? But what would happen is when they would conquer territory or other things, they would bring in those gods and they would celebrate their feast days every year. Feast days are a big thing. And in the empire, they would celebrate the birthday of the emperor and things like that. The Romans were kind of always looking for a reason to party, and they would do that in these specific feast days. Now, a lot of times temples didn't have uses if it wasn't a feast day, except if it was the temple of the Vestal Virgins. A lot of times these temples would be open once or twice a year. Like even the temple of Janus, Janus being the god that rings in the new year. That's why we have January. It's the two-faced Roman god. You could be a good year or it could be a bad year. And so you have to understand, they would be celebrating these feast days, or they would be celebrating. They actually had offices in Rome that were responsible for creating feasts. So it was a big thing for them.
Gotcha. Okay. And my last two questions from me, bringing it full circle to the journey that I'm on. What do you think is the proper role of government?
Less of it, a whole lot less of it. If you look at, I think you and I commented back and forth on this on Twitter or on X recently. If you look at kind of the major flipping point for America in kind of the 20th century, it's the year 1913, because there's three major things that happened that year, which make America less of a representative republic and more of a direct democracy. We haven't been a functional republic in a very long time, and then we kind of get the presidency getting more power. But in 1913, we have the Federal Reserve Act that passes, income tax that passes, and the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment takes away the ability of state legislatures to name senators. Now, they did it for the right reasons, because what was happening is corruption was causing these people to get offices and they shouldn't have been. What we should have done is look at how do we handle the corruption rather than break down the Senate, because then what happens now is the House and the Senate serve the exact same purpose, and now states have no representation. So if you want to look at kind of where we are, we've gone way more federal, we've gone to way less state power, and it's really just centralizing in the character of the president over the last, I'd say, since at least the Second World War, maybe before that. Some people make a case for after the Civil War. But really, I think that it's less federal power, it's more power to the states, and then we cooperate on things that we need a federal government for. Other than that, I think there needs to be less government.
Right. That's something I hear from many of my guests. And then the form of government. I'm really interested in your opinion on this, being familiar with the classics. What is it? Is it philosopher king? Is that the ideal? Is a representative democracy? I mean, do we have any thoughts on that?
I think our representative republic as it was originally fashioned, because as I said, we've gotten away from that. I think it worked very well before that point. We didn't have central banking. We didn't have a lot of different things. I think if we went back to how the Constitution is supposed to function, it would function very well. But we've gotten very far away from that, and we have one person that has a lot of power. I do think our founders and our framers are very smart, and they put together a great system because they looked at what are the best aspects of monarchy, what are the best aspects of democracy, what are the best aspects of republic, and they came up with our system. And I think our system, right, if it functioned in the way that it's supposed to function, is very good. But the problem is it hasn't in a very long time.
Yeah, it's so interesting for me to consider the possibility that the best form of government might mean going back in time. In other words,
I don't know if we can anymore, though.
Well, with that aside for the moment, I mean, talking about questioning the progressive worldview that I was raised with, the idea that your progress is always better. Well, maybe that's not the case. Maybe you need to go backwards a little bit. But you said we can't put the genie back in the bottle.
I would like to, but the problem is, like, do you think they're ever going to get rid of the Federal Reserve, though I'd like them to? Do you think that we're ever going to end income tax? I know Trump's saying he'd like to do that, but he can't. It has to be a constitutional amendment. And I don't think enough people understand the 17th Amendment for it to be an issue. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah, no, they don't understand why more direct democracy would not necessarily be good. And this is exactly what my buddy Herb always talks about. He cites the same reasons. Many libertarians, people on the right, cite these same arguments. And he said his plan, which is, again, to go to these selection systems, it will never be accepted until shit hits the fan. And he thinks at some point the economy is gonna blow. And that
I am in agreement with him.
That's unfortunate. Let's hope not. Hey, so
I've watched history, man. Unless we can do what Constantine did, we're in trouble.
Currency. So currency
is the number one thing because it fixes everything. Like, right? You know, if you have money that has value, you can fix things.
Right. Well, this has been an amazing conversation, and I so appreciate your time. You know what? I'm going to do it. I'm going to ask you one weird question. Do you ever get asked about aliens on all the podcasts you do? Do you ever talk, do you ever enter that space, the UFO? Is that all just online bullshit from a historian?
It came up with the drones recently. Like I had a conversation with the Nephilim Death Squad. And I was like, I had this idea. I'm like, I think it's the government causing the situation because if they cause a problem, they have a reason to regulate. Because if you look at it, like Rick Scott had a bill ready to go before the drones popped up. And they're like, so let's talk about interdimensional time travelers. I'm like, all right, guys. I don't know, man. I think to think we're the only ones in this universe is a little, I don't know, egotistical. There's probably something else out there.
But it's as a expert in ancient Rome. And do you consider yourself a historian generally, or do you say I'm an expert in ancient Rome?
I say I'm a regular person that understands history, man. Because I know that I probably said like 25 different things wrong in this thing, and we're gonna get 50 comments telling me I'm an idiot or whatever it might be. But I like to make history make sense to regular people.
If we get 50 comments, you're my hero, and I'll be sending you a check.
I think knowledge is power, and I think the more we know about our history, and the more we can think with it and make discussions. I would definitely tell people, go read some primary sources, like things that were written during that time, like Tacitus and Livy and things like that, and see what people had to say about it. But if I at least sparked their interest today to go look, I think I did my job.
I think you did, man. And I'm so grateful for your time. Do you want to tell us what you're working on and where we can find you?
So I think podcasts and new media are the number one way that we communicate in this world now. And we see even like it helped to get a president elected. And since 2016, I've been running a company called Command Your Brand, where we help our clients to be on the right podcast and get their messages out. So you can find us over at commandyourbrand.com. If you're interested in listening to me flap more about history and politics, whatever it is, I'm at Jeremy Ryan Slate on X.
This has been a real treat, Jeremy. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, man.
Yep. Take care, man. Talk to you soon.